Okay, my task today is to help us preach the Wisdom Psalms. So you can access the slides with just a QR code there. So I've scripted this so that I wouldn't take up more than 15 minutes. There are two difficulties associated with preaching Wisdom Psalms. First, there's something about preaching poetry that preachers find difficult. I've often asked students if they hear the Psalms preached in their churches, the response is typical. The Psalms are used often as a call to worship, but seldom preached through systematically. The second difficulty concerning the idea of wisdom altogether. Wisdom as a concept is fluid. As a genre of Psalms, it is also hard to pin down. That is why there's little agreement between some scholars on the list of wisdom Psalms. So we have two major problems this afternoon. How should we understand and preach Hebrew poetry, number one? And how should we treat Psalms with wisdom element? So on this slide, we see an interesting 10th century CE graphical interpretation of Psalms 112 in the Utrecht Psalter. Here the artist drew the righteous man right at the center of the picture, the little white box there, blessed with a big house, and he is holding on to God's commandment, and people are coming to him because he is gracious and compassionate. At the top of the house, we see the horn, like a horn, the righteous horn exalted. At the bottom left, we see the wicked grouped together in the ground to be destroyed. So let me begin the topic proper by summarizing three broad hermeneutical perspectives to understand and exegete any psalm. Okay, this slide is, 3 years in the making. Hopefully, it'll give us some guidance to interpret and preach the psalms. Now, the first broad step is to study the form and structure of a single psalm as shown in the black box. So just as we study the plot, characterization, and point of view when we interpret narratives, we analyze the form and structure in Hebrew poetry. Okay? By form and structure, I mean how the texts are shaped through the choice of words, syntax, repetitions, parallelism, etc. This is because in Hebrew poetry, form and content are closely connected. The shape and the literary devices in the poem usually carry the message. So in this first step, we try to uncover as many poetic and rhetorical features of the psalm as possible. And these features will help us identify the major strophes, stanzas in the psalm. And once we understand the structure, we can see the development and focus of the entire poem. Books on interpreting Hebrew poetry, and they typically focus on this first area, the black box. And our own Dr. Sam Goh, he has written a book, Basics of Hebrew Poetry, is one very good example on that. Now, in the second box, blue box, we try to understand the psalm in view of its adjacent psalms and in light of the literary horizon of the whole psalter. We look out for recurring and developing motifs across a sweep of psalms, and our aim is to situate that psalm of interest in view of the whole book. So this step in the process is sometimes called the canonical approach, and this is developing into a major area of research in psalm scholarship in the last 30 or 40 years. And there's a growing amount of literature associated with that. So however, scholars who focus on Hebrew poetics in the first box are usually different from those who focus on the canonical approach, at least. In the final brown box, interpreter needs to look beyond the Psalter. Since half the Psalter is made out of Davidic Psalms, it is important that we give emphasis to the story of David. We do this by reading intertextually or intra-biblically. In other words, the understanding of a psalm requires the reconstruction of the story of David from the historical books. The psalm presumes a historical David. Theologically speaking, the crucial component in the Davidic narratives of the historical books is God's covenant with David. Thus, it is important to detect this element of God's covenant with David in the Psalms as well. Okay, so now we will apply, before we apply this method or this approach to the Psalm, let me say something first about wisdom, this problematic wisdom genre. Since Hermeneutical form criticism in the early 1900s, A handful of psalms have been categorized as wisdom. The difficulty, as noted earlier, is defining wisdom, and different scholars define wisdom differently, and that is why we have they may add or subtract to the list that we see here. In general, wisdom psalms are characterized by elements found in the wisdom literature. By the time of Roland Murphy in the 1960s, a number of these elements have been systematized, as seen here, and is still being systematized. I've highlighted a few of them in blue because they will characterize Psalms 112, which we will now use to to show our method. Okay, hope you can see this. This slide shows how I have applied the first box, the black box, on Psalms 112. Now, most scholars have categorized this psalm as a wisdom psalm, and we can easily see why. For instance, the first word translated as auspicious or blessed is a formula for blessing. The phrase, the man who fears God, is a concept found frequently in the wisdom literature. The binary sort of distinction between the righteous and the wicked is clear by the end of the psalm. Psalm 112 is also an alphabetical psalm, or alphabetical acrostic, and these are all elements of wisdom psalm. This psalm reads just like Psalm 1, okay, not Psalm 1, but Psalm number 1, which is also a wisdom psalm. Now, interestingly, the first and the last word of Psalm 112 are the exact same first and last words of Psalm 1, okay, which uses the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Structurally, this psalm has 10 verses and can be divided into 4 strophes, A to D. Now, strophe A functions as the introduction of the psalm, highlighting the blessedness of those who fear Yahweh and how they will perpetuate and influence others. And after this introduction in strophes B and C, it expands on the action, attributes, and how one who fears God will endure through adversity. Now, these descriptions of the God-fearer are framed by the phrases highlighted in red. His righteousness stands forever in verses 3 and 9. Within these frames, you can see 2 chiasmi, one in verses 4 and 5, the other in 7 and 8. And they are set in the green boxes there, as you can see. These chiasmi highlight the God-fearer's compassion and trust in Yahweh. And at the center of the whole acrostic poem is verse 6. This verse contains the 2 center letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Kaf and Lamet. By using the words never and always, verse 6 highlights the everlasting nature of the righteous in contrast to the destruction and passing away of the wicked. So in short, Psalms 112 is a Hallelujah wisdom psalm. Form-wise, it is an alphabetic acrostic, and semantically it focuses on the man who fears God. And by the use of different poetic features, the strategic placement of words and symmetrical poetic structure, this single psalm highlights not just a contrast between the righteous and the wicked, but also the character, action, and endurance of the righteous. Let me move on. Okay. Now, Psalms 112, now I move on to the second box, okay, is also to be viewed together with Psalms 111. Now, why do I say that? Just take a look at this slide. Both Psalms are alphabetic acrostics with 10 verses each. They are like a twin, right? They both have tricolons in the last 2 verses. Both emphasize the enduring power of righteousness, yet they also contrast 2 different outcomes. Psalms 111 ends with the word forever, while Psalm 112 ends with the word total or perish. There are many common lexemes between them, as we can see here. It is striking that the motive of fearing Yahweh at the end of Psalms 11 is found at the beginning of Psalms 112. Numerically, the first 5 Hebrew words of Psalms 112, blessed is the man who fears God, is the exact mathematical center of both Psalms. Okay. So when we expand our understanding of Psalms 112 to the entire Psalter and beyond, we see a further development of this righteous God-fearer. As shown here in the red circles, dotted circle. The twin Psalms 111 and 112 form bookends with Psalms 119, which is also an alphabetical acrostic, around an Egyptian Hallel, Psalms 113 to 18. And Psalms 101 to 119 in turn are bound by Davidic Psalms on its left, 108 to 110, and the Songs of Ascents, 120 to 134 on the right. So we have a scholar by the name of John Crutchfield. In his analysis of Psalms 107 to 118, he argues that the God-fearer in 112 should also be viewed in the horizon of Psalms 108 to 110. These three Davidic Psalms, 108 to 110, depict messianic, victorious, and a Davidic priest-king. Read in this direction of the red arrow, Psalms 112 presents a messianic kingly figure who is also righteous and compassionate like God. Okay, so we may not agree with Crutchfield's analysis, but it's important to see the following. The blue and orange boxes are examples where kingship and wisdom psalms are placed adjacent to each other in the Psalter. We see this right at the beginning with Psalm 1 as a wisdom psalm and Psalm 2 as a kingship psalm. Now, these pairs of kingship wisdom psalms are also strategically located at the seams of major compositional units in the Psalter. Such a phenomenon suggests that righteousness and wisdom is to be seen together with kingship. And Gerald Wilson has even argued for interlocking wisdom and royal sort of a framework for the entire Psalter. Now, what we want to achieve today is more modest. Now, this slide sort of summarizes our method and conclusion by looking at Psalm 112 alone. We see how the righteous and the blessed is blessed and can be a blessing to others. The God-fearer is one who endures through adversity by trusting in Yahweh. The wicked, however, perishes. When viewed with Psalms 111, and in light of the whole Psalter, we see that the one who is righteous is like God and his chosen king. This parallel is best seen with the pairs of wisdom and kingship psalms across the entire Psalter. The Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7 is the crucial framework that puts all of this together. In this covenant, the human king is to rule with wisdom and justice so that God's blessing will be fulfilled on the king and the people whom the king represents. And we know that the Davidic monarchy was broken with the Babylonian exile, but the Messianic king will rule with true justice, wisdom, and compassion, an enduring king who will usher in all the promises given to David. Read in this way, Psalms 112 continues to develop the portrait of the righteous man in the Psalter. Ultimately, we find this righteous man is also an image of the Messianic king we call Christ. That's it.
Yeah. Any questions?
Only 13 minutes.
Yes. Next question. Yes, I will read Psalms 1 and 2 as the prologue, and in fact, I call it. Yeah, in fact, I will add one more word to prologue. That is a programmatic prologue. It sort of provides the whole blueprint to read the entire Psalm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wouldn't that be also true for other genres as well? Yes. Yes. I mean, I tend to agree with that, though I don't want to. Yes.
But I think the first block has specific meaning with poetry.
Yeah. So I mean, some of this we see, we can apply it to different genres. I just want to limit today's presentation to just the Psalms. And I don't want to presume based on other genres per se, because we know in every interpretation of different genres there are different tools, nuances. Yeah. Okay, if I were to use something that I can, pick up from here that goes across, it would be the idea of unity, like the idea that we read from the whole, read with the whole, the individual or the singular, the unit with the whole. This small triangle below it basically is just to say we are moving in an expanding sort of a text. Yes. Yes, sorry. Yes, that's a very good question, because traditionally our interpretation of Messianic Psalms are that few Psalms that we see in the New Testament. But the problem is, how then do we deal with the rest of the other Psalms that does not seem to suggest any Messianic idea? So one of the things that I see that the idea of the Davidic covenant tying the entire book together. And because of the idea in the Davidic covenant, it brings us very nicely to the New Testament when we see this covenant being worked out, so to speak, with this special figure coming in, blameless, and so on. So, yeah.
So the problem is, we can speak of songs that become messianic rather than messianic songs. It's a matter of what songs are versus what they do.
Yes.
Would that be a right way to characterize your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of how Jesus would say, all the Psalms speaks of me, fulfill me, and then, so the Psalms will become messianic in that sense. Yes. Okay.
So you've got 73 Psalms written by David.
We have like
Would you say that
7.
each one of those is a messianic psalm? Because the whole book is messianic.
So well, the thing about my understanding of superscription is that they are intentionally used to sort of structure the whole book of the Psalms, and the whole book of Psalms is sort of set under this bigger theological framework called the Davidic covenant, so to speak. So there is no need, when I think of that in that way, then the superscription doesn't mean that just because there is a David there is a Messianic Psalm, but the whole book, it's one that points to Christ. Why so? Because the whole book allows us to see the entire meta-narrative. So this is something that it takes me a lot of time to be able to say this, but the 5 books sort of trace a meta-narrative, the establishment of the Davidic kingdom, its fall, and then its restoration. So it is under this entire framework we see the Davidic covenant at work. And so it is not, this Messianic Psalms idea is something that we put on the Psalms that speak of Christ. But even then, I think we need not be limited by that category per se. Yeah. David Hilton.
Yeah, what I found is basically when I teach hermeneutics, I teach this framework. What I found very interesting was that in my study, that Psalm 8, which has always been interpreted anthropologically, something what is man is our mind, the Son of Man that does care for him, we make him lower than. It's in the New Testament, appearing at 3 different places, I think it is always taken as messianic. And there's no way to explain it except that if you look at the Psalter and it is. So my explanation of the 5 books, it is like actually it is a whole cantata, it's a whole celebration of several feasts, and then each section one big movement, and then you move to the next section, and then end with a praise God forever and ever, amen. And then the next movement, and so the whole movement is a cantata of Israel celebrating and longing for the re-establishment of the Davidic
Yes. Cantata, that is by, I think, Wharton, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. So he has this idea that everything sort of come together like an orchestra to sing about this king. I think that is an understanding of how the whole book sort of fit together.
Yeah, I would agree with it, especially in the week starting from, I think, 145, some of the
145, yeah.
There are no more complaints, no more negative things. Praise Hallelujah. Yeah, and it ends with the finale 150.
Yeah.
Every verse of it is Hallelujah.
Yeah, every psalm from 146 to 150 begins and ends with Hallelujah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just wondering, how does the development of the Messianic Davidic king in the prophets come into play in your intertextual reading?
Okay.
The so-called Messianic development comes from the prophets.
Yes. That is a very good question. Recently, there's a guy, Blankenship. He wrote a book on how to read Isaiah in light of the Psalms. I'm thinking the opposite, how to read the Psalms in light of Isaiah or the prophetic books. And there are two primary ways through which the prophets sort of help me understand the Psalms. First of all, the idea of Zion. Zion is something that is central in the book of Psalms because this whole idea of Zion, its establishment and then its brokenness and its restoration that comes at the end. We see that in the beginning of Isaiah and the end of Isaiah as well. Now, when I began my research, I was looking at this idea of Zion in Book 5 of the Psalms. But you cannot see the idea or the concept of Zion apart from kingship. And when you put them together, the idea of the kingship as well as Zion, what is one category that sort of holds them together? And I would think that the covenant, the idea of the covenant, especially the Davidic covenant, is central to sort of put all of this together with the idea of Torah and the book of, and the prophets especially, is something that tells the readers that they have broken the law, they did not follow the Torah. So the idea of Torah, the temple, and kingship all comes together in trying to understand this connection. I think they don't just cut across the Psalms, but also the Torah as well. So there are a lot of parallels there.
If we look at the plot, can you say that reconstruction primarily from historical books and messianic development of the Davidic figure from the prophets? Would that be kind of more encompassing of what you're thinking?
The word that you use is problematic for me, the word development. What do you mean? Are you asking about the historical, chronological development, redaction of text, or are you asking something else?
But something more. What I meant was like to relate this messianic thing together with the prophets. Would that help to kind of make clear of what you're thinking?
Yeah. Let me rephrase. Perhaps based on what we have done today, the idea of how to live right with God is central in the prophets, right? And that the failure of Israel to live right is now what we can see, especially in Psalms 101 to 103. This righteous figure, blameless figure, who ultimately lives right, who keeps the Torah. And that thing sort of we see develop in the book of Psalms and this messianic figure. Yeah. So hopefully that helps a bit. Okay. Last one.
The last question. Okay.
All we have, I think I am with all these interactions, which I think integrated in nature, which is a very good result. Just one particular pragmatic question: how do we translate all of these into a sermon?
Yeah. So once we have this right, that's a very good question because that's something that we all try to do. When we talk about this, straight away we see a number of things. Like, what is the destiny of how a person, the destiny of a Christian, all right, how he suffers or endures difficulties in life, how he tries to live a righteous life, but knowing that this effort is not what you call sufficient. Ultimately, it requires this righteous, wise king to achieve that righteousness. So in a sense, we can already see, we can already point somewhat to Christ's work on the cross for righteousness. Already you can bring in this righteousness is a God-like kind of a righteousness, not the human kind of righteousness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a